My grandpa's will said I'd only get his fortune if I lived with his worst enemy. What would you do if inheriting millions meant living with your grandfather's nemesis for a year? Hey everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Taylor, and I was 25 when my life took the most unexpected turn. Grandpa Henry had always been the eccentric millionaire in our family, known for his wild parties, elaborate practical jokes, and a mysterious feud that had lasted half a century. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep at 87, I never imagined that his final prank would be on me. The reading of the will was held in the law firm's mahogany-paneled conference room, where Mr. Harrison, the family attorney, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat repeatedly. I sat there in my second-best dress, surrounded by distant relatives I barely recognized, all of us wondering how Grandpa's multi-million-dollar fortune would be distributed. "To my beloved granddaughter, Taylor," Mr. Harrison began, and I sat up straighter. "I leave my entire estate, including the mansion on Maple Street, my investment portfolio, valued at approximately $42 million, and all other assets, with one condition." The room fell silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, a mixture of envy and curiosity. "The condition is this," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice steady despite the palpable tension. "Taylor must reside for 1 full year with Mr. Robert Caldwell at his residence on Oak Avenue without interruption. Should Taylor complete this requirement, the estate transfers entirely to her. Should she fail to do so, the estate will be donated to various charities I have specified." Gasps echoed through the room. Robert Caldwell. The name hung in the air like a storm cloud. Everyone in our family knew that name. He was Grandpa's worst enemy, his arch nemesis, the man with whom Grandpa had feuded for 50 years. No one seemed to know exactly what had started it, but the rivalry was legendary in our small town. Mr. Harrison continued reading, but I barely heard the rest. My mind was racing. Live with Robert Caldwell? The man Grandpa had cursed at across the grocery store. The man whose prize-winning roses Grandpa had allegedly accidentally sprayed with weed killer? The man who had been Grandpa's neighbor for 50 years and somehow his sworn enemy for just as long. After the meeting, as relatives offered condolences that were really congratulations in disguise, I slipped away to the bathroom to process. Looking at my reflection in the mirror, I saw a young woman who had been working as a part-time barista while trying to save enough to go back to college. Now, this same young woman had the chance to become a multi-millionaire, but only by spending a year with the devil himself, according to Grandpa's stories anyway. The next day, I found myself standing before Mr. Harrison's desk again, asking for more details. "Your grandfather was quite specific," he explained, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. "Here's the full agreement. You must move in within 2 weeks of the will reading. You must stay for exactly 365 days without leaving for more than 48 hours at a time. You cannot have overnight guests, and Mr. Caldwell must sign an agreement that he will provide you with reasonable accommodations and not evict you during this period." I opened the envelope and read through the documents. Everything seemed legally sound, though bizarre. There was even a clause specifying that if I or Mr. Caldwell tried to harm each other physically, the inheritance would be forfeited. Why would he do this? I asked, more to myself than to the attorney. Mr. Harrison smiled slightly. "Your grandfather always said there are 2 sides to every story. Perhaps he wanted you to discover that for yourself." That evening, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the meager possessions I'd accumulated over 25 years. On one hand, there was the promise of financial security for the rest of my life. On the other, there was the uncertainty of living with a man my grandpa had described as the most conniving, despicable human being to ever walk the earth. As I looked out my window at the city lights, I made my decision. Tomorrow, I would call Robert Caldwell. Tomorrow, I would begin the strangest year of my life. Little did I know that this decision would not only change my financial situation, but would also uncover secrets that had been buried for decades. The call to Robert Caldwell was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. My hands trembled as I dialed the number Mr. Harrison had provided. When a gruff voice answered, I nearly hung up. "Mr. Caldwell, my name is Taylor, Henry's granddaughter." Silence. Then, the lawyer called, about the will. "Yes," I managed. "I was wondering if we could meet to discuss the arrangements." Another pause. "Tomorrow at 10. Don't be late." The line went dead before I could respond. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning as my mind raced with questions about the man I would be living with for the next year. What was he really like? Had Grandpa exaggerated their feud? And most importantly, what had happened between them 50 years ago that had sparked such animosity? The next morning, I arrived at 9:55 at a modest but well-maintained house on Oak Avenue. It was nothing like Grandpa's sprawling mansion, but it had a certain charm with its manicured lawn and colorful flower beds. As I raised my hand to knock, the door swung open. Standing before me was a man in his late 70s, tall and thin, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. This was Robert Caldwell. "You're early," he said, not as a compliment but as an accusation. "I'm sorry, I can come back." He sighed, stepping aside. "No, come in. Let's get this over with." The interior of his home was immaculate, every surface polished, every item in its perfect place. It was the complete opposite of Grandpa's chaotic, cluttered mansion where every surface held some strange trinket or memento. We sat in his living room, facing each other across a coffee table that looked too delicate to actually use. "So," he began, "Henry's last joke, making his granddaughter live with his worst enemy." He actually used air quotes around the words. "Did you and my grandfather really hate each other?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Robert Caldwell studied me for a long moment before answering. "That's a complicated question with a very long answer. For now, let's focus on logistics. You'll have the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. It's small but comfortable. You'll have your own bathroom. We share the kitchen and living areas. I expect cleanliness and consideration. No parties, no overnight guests, no illegal activities. And most importantly," he leaned forward, "don't touch anything in my study without permission." "Of course," I replied, feeling like a child being scolded. He stood up. "I'll show you your room." The guest room was indeed small, but well-appointed, with a comfortable-looking bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the backyard garden. It was clean and impersonal, like a hotel room. "You can move in any time this week," he said from the doorway. "The lawyer will have you sign some papers. After that, we're both stuck with this arrangement for a year." With that, he left, and I was alone in what would be my bedroom for the next 365 days. As I looked around the sterile room, I couldn't help but wonder what secrets this house held and what had really happened between my grandfather and the man who would now be my landlord. The next few days were a blur of packing, saying temporary goodbyes to friends, and signing the legal documents that would bind me to this strange arrangement. On Friday, I moved into Robert Caldwell's house with 3 suitcases, a box of books, and a heart full of trepidation. My first week was awkward and tense. Robert and I established a routine of polite but distant coexistence. We ate breakfast together in silence, went our separate ways during the day, and occasionally crossed paths in the evening. He was always cordial but never warm, maintaining a careful distance that felt both deliberate and practiced. One evening, as I was making tea in the kitchen, I noticed a framed photograph on the counter. It showed 2 young men, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. One was unmistakably my grandfather, but the other was a much younger Robert Caldwell. "What are you looking at?" Robert's voice made me jump. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I was just admiring this photo. You and my grandfather seemed close." Robert's expression hardened as he picked up the frame. "This was taken a long time ago. Before a lot of things." "Before the feud?" I asked gently. He didn't answer, instead placing the photo face down on the counter. Some things are better left in the past. As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to this story than I knew. The photograph suggested a friendship that had once been strong and genuine. What could have been so terrible that it turned these two men from friends to enemies? That night, lying in my bed, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not only complete this year to secure my inheritance, I would also uncover the truth about what had happened between my grandfather and Robert Caldwell. The next few days were a blur of packing, saying temporary goodbyes to friends, and signing the legal documents that would bind me to this strange arrangement. On Friday, I moved into Robert Caldwell's house with 3 suitcases, a box of books, and a heart full of trepidation. My first week was awkward and tense. Robert and I established a routine of polite but distant coexistence. We ate breakfast together in silence, went our separate ways during the day, and occasionally crossed paths in the evening. He was always cordial but never warm, maintaining a careful distance that felt both deliberate and practiced. One evening, as I was making tea in the kitchen, I noticed a framed photograph on the counter. It showed 2 young men, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. One was unmistakably my grandfather, but the other was a much younger Robert Caldwell. "What are you looking at?" Robert's voice made me jump. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I was just admiring this photo. You and my grandfather seemed close." Robert's expression hardened as he picked up the frame. "This was taken a long time ago. Before a lot of things." "Before the feud?" I asked gently. He didn't answer, instead placing the photo face down on the counter. Some things are better left in the past. As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to this story than I knew. The photograph suggested a friendship that had once been strong and genuine. What could have been so terrible that it turned these 2 men from friends to enemies? That night, lying in my bed, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not only complete this year to secure my inheritance, I would also uncover the truth about what had happened between my grandfather and Robert Caldwell. Little did I know that this quest for truth would lead me down a path I never expected, revealing secrets that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. The first month of living with Robert Caldwell passed in a tense but manageable rhythm. We had settled into an unspoken agreement to avoid each other as much as possible while maintaining the appearance of cohabitation required by the will. I spent my days exploring the small town where my grandfather had lived most of his life, visiting places he had mentioned in his stories, and trying to piece together the puzzle of his long-standing feud with Robert. The townspeople were friendly but cautious when they learned I was Henry's granddaughter living with the enemy. Mrs. Peterson at the bakery nearly dropped my cinnamon roll when I mentioned my living arrangement. "Robert Caldwell?" she whispered, looking around as if afraid someone might overhear. "That's brave of you, dear. Most people around here try to stay out of their business." "Do you know what happened between them?" I asked, hoping for some insight. She shook her head, lowering her voice even more. "No one knows the whole story. It started back when they were young men, barely older than you. Something to do with a woman, some say. Others say it was business. All anyone knows for sure is that they went from being inseparable to mortal enemies overnight." This confirmed what I had suspected. There was more to the story than the petty squabbles my grandfather had occasionally mentioned. The photograph I had seen suggested a genuine friendship, and Mrs. Peterson's words hinted at a dramatic turning point. Back at the house, I began to notice small things that seemed out of place with the image of 2 mortal enemies. In the living room bookshelf, nestled between books on gardening and history, was a photo album that contained pictures of my grandfather and Robert together through various stages of their lives. Teenage years, young adulthood, even what appeared to be a joint family vacation with children in tow. The most surprising discovery came when I was dusting the mantelpiece and found a small, ornate box tucked behind a row of books. Inside was a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon.
The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakably my grandfather's, but they were addressed to Robert, and the dates spanned several decades. I wrestled with my conscience for days. These were private letters, not meant for my eyes. But my curiosity, and perhaps a sense that these letters held the key to understanding my grandfather's true intentions, eventually won. I carefully untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters started shortly after whatever incident had ended their friendship. The first one was formal and stilted, but as I read through the collection, I could see the gradual softening of tone, the occasional references to shared memories, and the underlying current of affection that seemed to contradict everything I had been told about their relationship. The most recent letter, dated just a month before my grandfather's death, was particularly revealing. "Robert, my old friend," it began. "Another year has passed, and still we maintain this ridiculous charade. Sometimes I wonder why we continue after all this time. I suppose pride is a powerful thing, even in old age. I think often of that summer by the lake, before everything changed. Do you remember how we planned to build cabins side by side? How we promised our children would grow up as close as brothers? I'm getting older, and I find myself regretting the years we've wasted. Perhaps it's not too late for us to mend what's been broken. Perhaps, in time, we might even sit on my porch and share a bottle of that terrible whiskey we used to pretend to enjoy. Your friend, despite everything, Henry." This letter changed everything. If my grandfather had regretted their feud, why had he included such a strange condition in his will? Why force me, his granddaughter, to live with the man he claimed to despise? I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I didn't hear Robert enter the room. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice cold. I jumped, quickly trying to hide the letters, but it was too late. He had already seen them in my hands. "These are private," he said, holding out his hand. "I'm sorry," I stammered, handing over the letters. "I was dusting and I found the box. I shouldn't have read them." Robert's expression softened slightly as he took the letters from me. "No, perhaps you should have. Henry always did have a flair for the dramatic."
And this will of his is his final performance. He sat down in the armchair across from me, the letters in his lap. For the first time since I had met him, he seemed to let down his guard. "How much did you read?" he asked. "Most of them," I admitted. "The last one especially. I don't understand. If you and my grandfather were friends, why all this? Why the feud? Why make me live here?" Robert sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "That's a very long story, Taylor. One that begins and ends with your grandmother. My grandmother had died when I was very young, and I knew little about her beyond the few stories my grandfather had shared." "What about her?" I asked. "Your grandfather and I," Robert began slowly, "we were best friends from childhood. We did everything together, served in the military, started our first business, even double-dated in college. Then we met Eleanor." He looked at a photograph on the mantelpiece, a beautiful woman with dark hair and a warm smile that I recognized from my grandfather's photo albums. "We both fell in love with her," Robert continued, his voice distant. "She was the most remarkable woman I had ever met. Funny, intelligent, kind. We both thought she was out of our league." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "She chose Henry, of course, and I was happy for them, truly. Eleanor was too special to hold a grudge. We remained friends, even after they married. You were born, and I was your honorary uncle, coming over to babysit and spoil you rotten." This was all news to me. I had no memory of Robert from my early childhood, no recollection of this close relationship he described. "What changed?" I asked. Robert's expression darkened. "Eleanor got sick. Cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months, but she fought for 2 years. During that time, Henry and I grew closer than ever. I helped him take care of her, sat with her when he needed a break, promised her I would look after him and you when she was gone." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden. "A week after she died,
Henry came over. He was drunk, angry, grief-stricken. He accused me of being in love with Eleanor, of using her illness to get close to her. He said I had betrayed him, that I had been waiting for her to die so I could have a chance with him. He turned back to face me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I never told him he was right about how I felt about Eleanor. I never told him that I had loved her from the moment we met, that I had stepped aside because I wanted her to be happy, even if it wasn't with me. I just let him believe the worst, because I was hurt and angry that he would think so little of me after all our years of friendship. "And the feud?" I asked, softly. "Started that day," Robert said. 50 years of nonsense, of competing over everything, of making our lives miserable. And for what? Because two grieving men were too proud to admit they were wrong. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process this revelation. The feud that had defined my grandfather's relationship with Robert, the condition in his will that had brought me here, it all stemmed from a misunderstanding born of grief and pride. "But why make me live with you?" I asked. "If he regretted it, why not just end the feud himself?" Robert smiled sadly. "Because your grandfather was a stubborn man who had backed himself into a corner. After 50 years of animosity, how could he suddenly admit it was all based on a lie? This will, this condition, it was his way of bringing us together without having to admit he was wrong. He knew you were curious, that you wouldn't be content to simply live here without asking questions. He used you, Taylor, to finally mend what he didn't have the courage to fix himself." I didn't know how to respond to this. On one hand, I felt used, manipulated by my grandfather even after his death. On the other, I could understand his reluctance to admit 50 years of pride and stubbornness had been misplaced. "Does anyone else know?" I asked. "Just us," Robert replied. "And now you." As I absorbed this information, I realized that my year here would be about more than just securing an inheritance. It would be about healing a 50-year-old wound, about helping two proud old men find their way back to friendship. And perhaps, in the process, I would discover more about myself and the family I thought I knew. The next morning at breakfast, the atmosphere between Robert and me had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was different now, tinged with the unspoken truth we shared. "I've been thinking," Robert said, pushing aside his newspaper, "about what I told you last night. There's more to the story, things you should know about your grandmother and your grandfather." I looked up from my toast, surprised by his willingness to continue our conversation. "Eleanor wasn't just the woman we both loved," he continued. "She was also the peacemaker between us. Whenever we had disagreements, she was the one who would smooth things over, remind us of our friendship. After she died, there was no one left to mediate." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The first few years after she passed were the hardest. We competed over everything: business, property, even community standing. It was ridiculous looking back. Two grown men acting like children, each trying to prove he was more successful, more important. What changed?" I asked. "Time, mostly," Robert replied with a shrug. "As we got older, the anger faded, replaced by a sort of stubborn inertia. We had been enemies for so long that we didn't know how to be anything else. Occasionally, one of us would reach out, like those letters you found, but we could never quite bridge the gap." He stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner of the dining room, returning with a worn, leather-bound journal. "This was Eleanor's," he said, placing it on the table between us. "She gave it to me shortly before she died, told me to read it when I was ready. I never could bring myself to do it. Perhaps you should." I reached out and touched the journal, feeling the soft leather under my fingers. It seemed to hold the weight of 50 years of unresolved history, of secrets and regrets. "I don't know," I said uncertainly. "These are her private thoughts." Robert smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time since I had met him. Eleanor would have wanted you to read it. She always said the truth was meant to be shared, not hidden away. And the truth about what happened between your grandfather and me, it's not just our story, Taylor, it's your story too. That evening, alone in my room, I opened the journal. The pages were filled with my grandmother's elegant handwriting, chronicling the last year of her life. As I read, I discovered a woman of incredible strength, humor, and wisdom. A woman who faced her mortality with grace and concern for the people she loved. One entry, dated 3 months before her death, caught my attention. Robert came by today. Henry was at work, and we had a chance to talk alone. He asked me to tell Henry the truth about how he feels, but I can't. It would break Henry's heart to know that his best friend has been in love with me all these years. And it would break Robert's heart to be rejected once again. Sometimes I wish I could tell them both that love doesn't always have to be romantic, that the deep friendship they share is just as precious. But men can be so foolish about such things. I've decided to write letters to both of them, to be opened after I'm gone. Perhaps then, when the rawness of grief has faded, they might understand how much they mean to each other, how much they need each other's friendship. I closed the journal, my mind racing. My grandmother had known about Robert's feelings and had planned to help them reconcile after her death. But something had gone wrong. Henry had found out about Robert's feelings before he was meant to, and in his grief and jealousy, he had interpreted it as a betrayal rather than the unrequited love it was. The next morning, I approached Robert as he was tending his roses. "My grandmother wrote about you in her journal," I said gently. "She knew how you felt about her." Robert straightened up, wiping dirt from his hands. "She was a perceptive woman. She knew me better than I knew myself sometimes. She planned to help you and Grandpa reconcile after she died. She wrote letters to both of you." Robert nodded slowly. "I never got a letter. After she died, Henry came over, angry and drunk. He accused me of, well, you know what he accused me of. I was so hurt that I didn't try to explain. I just let him believe what he wanted to believe." "Do you think my grandfather found the letters before they were meant to be read?" I asked. Maybe that's what triggered his anger. Robert considered this possibility. "It's possible. Eleanor always said Henry was impulsive, especially when he was emotional. If he found those letters and read them out of context, without her explanation," he didn't need to finish the sentence. "I could imagine my grandfather, grief-stricken and angry, reading letters that revealed his best friend's love for his wife, misinterpreting them as evidence of betrayal rather than the unrequited devotion they represented." "Where would the letters be now?" I asked. "If Henry found them, probably destroyed," Robert replied with a sigh. "If not, they might still be somewhere in his house." A thought struck me. His will mentioned that I inherited his entire estate, including the mansion. That means I have access to it, right? Robert nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The mansion has been closed up since he died. No one's been inside except the lawyers to inventory everything." "Then that's where we need to look," I said, determination building inside me. "If we can find those letters, maybe we can finally understand what really happened." As we made plans to visit my grandfather's mansion the next day, I couldn't help but feel that we were on the verge of uncovering a truth that had been hidden for 50 years. A truth that might finally heal the rift between two old friends and help me understand the complex legacy my grandfather had left behind. The following morning, Robert and I stood before my grandfather's mansion, a sprawling Victorian house that had always seemed more like a museum than a home. As I inserted the key into the front door, I felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. We were about to search for clues that might unravel a 50-year-old mystery. The interior of the house was exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits, cluttered with artifacts from my grandfather's travels, furniture that had seen better decades, and an overwhelming sense of the man who had lived here. "Where should we start?" I asked, looking around at the daunting amount of stuff. "His study," Robert replied without hesitation. "That's where he kept all his important papers. If the letters are anywhere, they'll be there." The study was a large room lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, with a massive oak desk dominating the space.
Papers were stacked haphazardly on every available surface, creating a paper landscape that seemed to have grown organically over the years. "This could take a while," I said, surveying the chaos. Robert smiled slightly. Henry was never one for organization, but he was sentimental. If he found those letters, he wouldn't have thrown them away. He would have kept them somewhere. We began our search, methodically going through stacks of papers, opening drawers, and examining the contents of boxes that had been tucked away for years. Hours passed as we worked in a comfortable silence, occasionally finding something that sparked a memory or a story about my grandfather. It was Robert who finally found them, tucked away in a small locked box in the bottom drawer of the desk. "The key," he said, holding up the box. "There's a small keyhole." I remembered a small silver key on my grandfather's keychain, one that I had put in my pocket after the will reading. Retrieving it from my wallet, I handed it to Robert, who carefully unlocked the box. Inside were 2 envelopes, yellowed with age, one addressed to Robert and one to my grandfather. Both were sealed with my grandmother's distinctive wax seal, a small rose that she had pressed into the wax. We sat there for a moment, just looking at the letters that had changed the course of 2 men's lives. "Are you ready for this?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was truly prepared for what these letters might reveal. Robert carefully opened the letter addressed to him first, his hands trembling slightly. As he read, his expression softened, and I could see tears welling in his eyes. "My dear Robert," he read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. Please don't grieve for me too long. I have lived a full and happy life, surrounded by people I love. I need to tell you something that I should have told you years ago. I have always known about your feelings for me, from the very beginning. I saw it in your eyes the first time we met, in the way you looked at me when you thought no one was watching. I want you to know that I was deeply honored by your love, even though I could not return it in the way you hoped. What I felt for you was a deep and abiding friendship, a connection that I cherished as much as my love for Henry. Henry knows nothing of this, and I would prefer it to remain that way. He has a tendency to be jealous, and I don't want anything to come between the friendship you two share. You have been brothers in all but blood, and that bond is too precious to risk. I am leaving this letter with instructions that it be given to you after my death. By then, I hope enough time will have passed that you can read these words without pain, understanding that my choice was not a rejection of you, but simply a matter of the heart following where it must. Please take care of Henry for me. He will be lost without me, and he needs his best friend now more than ever. And please, Robert, don't let my death come between you. Your friendship has been one of the greatest gifts in my life, and I would hate for that to be lost. With deepest affection, Eleanor." Robert finished reading and wiped tears from his eyes. 50 years, he said softly. 50 years of anger and misunderstanding, all because I never got to read this letter. I reached out and placed my hand on his arm, and my grandfather never got to read his. Robert carefully opened the second letter, the one addressed to my grandfather, and began to read. "My dearest Henry, my love, my partner in all things. If you are reading this, then I am no longer with you, and my heart breaks at the thought of your grief. I need to tell you something that I should have told you long ago, but I was afraid of hurting you. Robert has been in love with me since the day we met. Before you jump to conclusions, please know that Robert has never acted on these feelings, never said or done anything inappropriate. He has been the truest friend a person could ask for, respectful of our marriage and our love. I am telling you this because I know you, Henry. I know your heart, and I know your tendency toward jealousy. I am afraid that in your grief, you might turn away from the person who has been your brother for most of your life. Robert needs you, my love, and you need him. Don't let my death come between you. Don't allow grief to twist your understanding of a friendship that has been one of the cornerstones of your life. Remember the promise we made when we married, that we would always be honest with each other, even when the truth was difficult. This is my final act of honesty with you. I love you more than words can say, and I will wait for you on the other side, where I hope you and Robert will eventually join me, still the best of friends I have ever known. Forever yours, Eleanor. As Robert finished reading, we both sat in stunned silence. The letters explained everything: my grandmother's wisdom and foresight, her understanding of both men, and her attempt to preserve their friendship even after her death. My grandfather must have found these letters before they were meant to be delivered, I said, the realization dawning on me. He must have read them out of context without my grandmother there to explain. Robert nodded slowly, and in his grief and jealousy, he saw only what he wanted to see: evidence of betrayal rather than the testament to a pure, unrequited love that these letters truly represent. What do we do now? I asked, feeling the weight of 50 years of misunderstanding settling around us. Robert thought for a moment before answering. We finish what your grandmother started. We honor her memory by finally mending what should never have been broken. As we left the study, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't experienced before. This year, which had begun as a strange condition in my grandfather's will, was transforming into something much more significant: a journey of discovery, healing, and redemption. The days that followed were different. Robert and I talked more openly about my grandparents, about their lives together, and about the friendship that had once existed between the two men. We spent evenings looking through old photo albums, with Robert sharing stories that painted a picture of a relationship I had never known existed. One afternoon, as we were sitting in the garden, Robert turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "There's something else you should know about your grandfather," he said. "Something that might help you understand why he structured his will the way he did." "About the condition that I live with you?" I asked. Robert nodded. "Your grandfather was proud, sometimes to a fault. After Eleanor died and we had our falling out, he painted himself into a corner. The longer the feud continued, the harder it became for him to admit that it was all based on a misunderstanding." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "In the last few years of his life, I think he regretted the rift between us. He would occasionally reach out, like those letters you found, but he could never quite bring himself to say the words, 'I was wrong.'" "So he used his will to force us together?" I asked, trying to understand my grandfather's logic. "In a way," Robert replied. "He knew you were curious, that you wouldn't be content to simply live here without asking questions. He created a situation where the truth would inevitably come to light, allowing him to mend what he couldn't bring himself to fix directly." I thought about this, trying to reconcile the man I had known, my fun-loving, mischievous grandfather, with the calculating strategist who had crafted such an elaborate posthumous plan. "It seems like a complicated way to go about it," I said. Robert smiled. "Your grandfather was nothing if not complicated. He loved grand gestures, elaborate schemes. This will, this condition, it was his final performance, his last practical joke with a serious purpose underneath." As the summer turned to fall, Robert and I settled into a comfortable routine. We were no longer just landlord and tenant, or even just co-conspirators in solving a 50-year-old mystery. We had become friends, connected by the shared history of the people we had both loved. One evening, as we were cleaning out the attic of my grandfather's mansion, we found a box labeled Memories. Inside were mementos from my grandparents' life together, photographs, ticket stubs, dried flowers, and other small treasures that told the story of their relationship. At the bottom of the box was a small leather-bound book. As I opened it, I realized it was my grandfather's journal, something I had never known existed. "Should we read it?" I asked, feeling a bit like I was intruding on my grandfather's privacy. Robert considered for a moment before nodding. "I think your grandfather would want you to. He was never one to leave things unsaid, even if he sometimes took the long way around to saying them."
The journal spanned several decades, but it was the entries from the last year of his life that caught my attention. They revealed a man wrestling with regret, trying to find a way to mend a friendship that had defined much of his life. October 15. Another year has passed since Eleanor's death. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, other times like a lifetime ago. I saw Robert at the grocery store today. We nodded at each other across the produce section, like two strangers who happened to shop at the same store. 50 years of this nonsense. When will it end? November 22. Thanksgiving alone again. The house feels empty without Eleanor's laughter, without the sound of Robert and I arguing good-naturedly over football while she tried to keep the peace. I miss those days more than I can say. I miss my friend. December 31. New Year's Eve. Another year ending, another year beginning with this rift between us. I've been thinking about what Eleanor would want. She would want us to reconcile, to remember the friendship that meant so much to both of us. But how? After all this time, how do we go back? January 14. Met with the lawyer today to discuss my will. I have an idea, a way to bring Robert and I together without having to admit I was wrong. It's manipulative, I know, but it might be the only way. Taylor will understand, I think. She has Eleanor's wisdom and compassion. February 28. The will is finalized. Taylor will have to live with Robert for a year. It's a lot to ask of her, but I trust her to navigate this situation with grace. I trust her to find the letters, to understand what happened, and I trust that by the end of the year, Robert and I will finally be able to put this behind us. March 10. Saw Robert today across the street. We made eye contact for a moment before both looking away. In that brief glance, I saw not an enemy, but a friend I've missed for 50 years. I hope my plan works. I hope it's not too late for us. As I finished reading the last entry, tears streamed down my face. My grandfather, the man I had thought was simply playing a final practical joke, had been trying to heal a wound that had festered for half a century. He had used me, yes, but with a purpose that went beyond mere manipulation. He had been trying to reconnect with a lost friend, to right a wrong that had haunted him for decades. Robert placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. He was a good man, your grandfather. Flawed, stubborn, but good. I know, I replied, wiping away my tears. I just wish I had understood him better when he was alive. We rarely do, Robert said softly. We rarely understand the people we love until it's too late to ask them the questions that matter. As winter gave way to spring, marking the halfway point of my required stay with Robert, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in 6 months. I had come here thinking only of the inheritance, of the financial security that awaited me at the end of this strange ordeal. But somewhere along the way, I had found something much more valuable. A connection to my family's past, a friendship with the man who had been my grandfather's best friend and worst enemy, and a deeper understanding of the complex web of love, friendship, pride, and forgiveness that had shaped all our lives. Spring arrived in our small town with a burst of color and new life, mirroring the changes that had taken place in Robert's house and in my own heart. The tension that had defined our initial living arrangement had gradually been replaced by a comfortable companionship, a friendship that felt both natural and profound. One sunny afternoon, as we were planting flowers in the garden, Robert turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "Eleanor loved this time of year. She always said spring was nature's way of reminding us that no matter how harsh the winter, there's always the promise of renewal." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," I replied, patting soil around a newly planted rosebush. "She was," Robert agreed, his voice soft with memory. "Your grandfather was lucky to have her, and I was lucky to know her." We worked in comfortable silence for a while before Robert spoke again. "There's something I've been wanting to show you," he said, "something that might help you understand your grandfather better." Later that evening, Robert led me to a small room off the hallway that I had assumed was just a storage closet. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with hundreds of vinyl records. "These were your grandfather's," Robert explained, running a finger along the spines of the albums. "After our falling out, he sold his house and moved into the mansion. He didn't have room for all his records, so he stored them here. We never spoke about it, but I think he knew I would take care of them. He carefully selected an album and placed it on the turntable. Soon, the room was filled with the sound of jazz music, a genre I knew had been my grandfather's favorite. Eleanor introduced us to jazz, Robert said, his eyes distant with memory. We used to spend Saturday nights at the Blue Note, listening to live music, talking about everything and nothing. After she died, I couldn't listen to jazz for years. It hurt too much. As the music filled the room, I could almost picture the two young men, my grandfather and Robert, sitting in some smoky club, lost in the music and their friendship. Your grandfather was a talented musician himself, Robert continued, pointing to a guitar case in the corner. He played the saxophone, not professionally, but well enough to make you feel the music in your bones. I had never known this about my grandfather. The man I had known was a businessman, a practical joker, a larger-than-life personality. I had never imagined him as a musician, pouring his emotions into a saxophone. Why did he stop playing? I asked. Robert's expression grew somber. After Eleanor died, he said the music died with her. He sold his saxophone and never played again. The revelation struck me with unexpected force. My grandfather, who had seemed so full of life and energy, had been carrying a grief so profound that had silenced the music within him. Sometimes, Robert continued, I think our feud was easier for him than facing his grief. Anger is an active emotion, you see. It requires energy, focus. Grief can be a passive, all-consuming void. Perhaps fighting with me was easier than falling into that void. As I listened to the jazz music that had once meant so much to both men, I realized that my understanding of my grandfather had been superficial at best.
The man I had thought I knew was a complex tapestry of joy and pain, love and loss, friendship and enmity. The following week, Robert suggested we visit my grandfather's grave. It was something I had been avoiding, not quite ready to face the finality of his death. The cemetery was peaceful, with old trees providing shade and birds singing in the branches. My grandfather's grave was marked by a simple headstone, his name carved beneath my grandmother's. I come here sometimes, Robert said, placing flowers on the grave, to talk to them both. Eleanor mostly, but sometimes Henry too, especially in the last few years. What do you say to him? I asked, curious about this side of their relationship that I was only now discovering. Robert smiled slightly. I tell him he's being stubborn. I tell him Eleanor would be disappointed in us. I tell him I miss my friend. He paused, looking at the headstone. Sometimes I imagine he answers back, telling me I'm just as stubborn as he is, that we're both fools for wasting so many years. As I stood there, between the grave of the grandfather I had loved and the man who had been his best friend and enemy, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The anger and misunderstanding that had defined their relationship for 50 years seemed to dissipate in the quiet of the cemetery, replaced by the enduring connection of shared history and mutual loss. That evening, as we were having dinner, Robert received a phone call that changed everything. "Excuse me," he said, his expression growing serious as he listened to the person on the other end. "Yes, I understand. No, there's no need to apologize. These things happen. I'll be there first thing in the morning." After hanging up, he sat down heavily in his chair. "What's wrong?" I asked, concerned by his sudden change in demeanor. Robert sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "That was Mr. Harrison, the lawyer. There's a complication with your grandfather's will." My heart sank. What kind of complication? "It seems there was a codicil, an amendment to the will that wasn't included in the initial reading," Robert explained, "a condition that changes everything." "What is it?" I asked, dreading the answer. Robert looked at me, his expression unreadable. "The codicil states that, if, at any point during your year of living with me, you and I develop a friendship or any form of positive relationship, the inheritance will be forfeited and donated to charity." I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. "But that doesn't make sense. Why would my grandfather include such a condition?" "That's not all," Robert continued, his voice heavy. "The codicil also specifies that, if you discover the true nature of our relationship with your grandmother, or if you find the letter she wrote to us, the inheritance is forfeited. I felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. Everything we had discovered, everything we had come to understand about my grandfather's true intentions, it was all part of some elaborate test that I had apparently failed. "But that contradicts everything," I said. "His journal entries, his letters to you, they all suggested he wanted us to reconcile, to understand what had really happened." Robert nodded slowly. "I know. That's what makes this so confusing. Either your grandfather changed his mind about the will at some point, or what?" I prompted. "Or there's something we're still missing," Robert replied. "Some piece of this puzzle that we haven't found yet." The next morning, we met with Mr. Harrison to examine the codicil ourselves. The document was genuine, signed and witnessed less than a month before my grandfather's death. "I don't understand," I said, looking at the document that threatened to undo everything. "Why would he do this?" Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses, considering my question. "Your grandfather was a complex man, Taylor. He enjoyed games, puzzles, elaborate schemes. Perhaps this was his final test, a way to ensure that your motivations were pure, that you weren't just going through the motions to secure the inheritance." "But that doesn't make sense," I protested. "The codicil essentially punishes us for doing exactly what his journal entries suggest he wanted us to do, understand the truth about his relationship with Robert and my grandmother." Mr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather did enjoy irony. Perhaps this was his way of ensuring that you would choose truth and reconciliation over financial gain." As we left the lawyer's office, I felt more confused than ever. The inheritance, which had initially seemed like a simple matter of fulfilling a strange condition, had become a complex moral dilemma. Did I continue my search for truth, knowing it might cost me millions? Or did I maintain a distant relationship with Robert, preserving the fiction that my grandfather's will seemed to require? That evening, as I sat in my room contemplating this dilemma, Robert knocked on my door. "I've been thinking," he said, entering the room, "about your grandfather, about this codicil. Something doesn't add up." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Your grandfather was many things. Stubborn, proud, sometimes manipulative," Robert said. "But he was never cruel. And this codicil, as it stands, is cruel. It forces you to choose between financial security and truth. Between honoring your grandmother's memory and securing your inheritance." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I think there's more to this codicil than meets the eye," he continued. "I think your grandfather, in his usual convoluted way, created a puzzle within a puzzle." "A puzzle within a puzzle?" I repeated, trying to follow his reasoning. Robert nodded. "What if the codicil isn't what it appears to be? What if it's part of a larger plan, one that we haven't fully understood yet?" The next day, we decided to revisit my grandfather's mansion, this time with a specific focus on finding any additional documents or clues that might shed light on the mysterious codicil. We started in the study, going through the papers we had previously examined with renewed attention to detail. It was Robert who noticed it first, a small notation in the margin of one of my grandfather's journal entries written in a different ink and clearly added later. The entry was dated 2 weeks before my grandfather's death, and it read, "The codicil is ready. Harrison thinks I'm being cruel, but he doesn't understand. This isn't about punishment, it's about choice. True understanding comes not from discovering truth, but from choosing it even when it costs something." Beneath this entry, in the different ink, was a small arrow pointing to a book on the shelf across the room. We exchanged glances before crossing to the bookshelf and examining the indicated book, a collection of poetry by Robert Frost. Inside the book, we found another envelope, this one addressed to me. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read. "My dear Taylor, if you are reading this, it means you have discovered the codicil and are questioning its purpose. I apologize for the confusion, but I hope you will understand my reasons. This codicil is not what it appears to be. It is not a punishment for discovering the truth, but rather a test of what you will do with that truth once you have found it. You see, my dear granddaughter, true understanding is not merely about knowing facts, but about internalizing them, allowing them to change you. I wanted to know if you would choose friendship and reconciliation over financial gain, not because you were forced to, but because you recognized their inherent value. The codicil is real, yes, but it contains a clause that Mr. Harrison was instructed to reveal only after you have made your choice. If you choose to continue your friendship with Robert despite the financial cost, you will find that the inheritance is not forfeited after all. Rather, it will be augmented with an additional foundation established in your name to support causes related to reconciliation and forgiveness. If, however, you choose to distance yourself from Robert to preserve the inheritance, then the codicil will stand as written, and the estate will go to charity. The choice, my dear Taylor, is yours. Do you choose truth and friendship, or do you choose wealth? Do you choose the lesson your grandmother tried to teach us all, or do you choose the path of least resistance? Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of you for having the courage to seek understanding, to look beyond the surface of things, to question and explore. That quality, more than any inheritance, is the true legacy I hope to leave you. With love and confidence in your wisdom, Henry. As I finished reading, tears streamed down my face. My grandfather, in his own complicated way, had created the ultimate test of character, not for my benefit alone, but as a final lesson in the values that had defined his life, even when he had struggled to live up to them. Robert placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "He always did have a flair for the dramatic," he said softly. I laughed through my tears. "He certainly did. But I think I understand now. This was never just about the money. It was about choosing what truly matters." As we left the mansion that day, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that I had never experienced before. The inheritance, which had initially seemed like the goal of this strange journey, had revealed itself to be merely a tool, a means to an end that was about much more than financial security. My grandfather, in his final act, had given me the opportunity to choose the kind of person I wanted to be, to demonstrate through my actions what I truly valued. And in that choice, I would find not only financial security, but also a deeper understanding of myself, my family, and the complex web of relationships that had shaped all our lives. The discovery of my grandfather's letter changed everything. What had initially seemed like a cruel twist in his will now revealed itself to be a profound test of character, one that would determine not only my financial future, but also the kind of person I would choose to be. As Robert and I drove back to his house, the weight of this decision settled upon me. On one hand, there was the promise of financial security, of never having to worry about rent or bills or tuition again. On the other hand, there was the friendship that had developed between us, the connection to my family's past, and the opportunity to honor my grandmother's legacy of love and forgiveness. "You don't have to decide right away," Robert said, as if reading my thoughts. "Your grandfather gave you a year for a reason. Take the time to really think about what matters to you." Over the next few weeks, I did exactly that. I spent time reflecting on everything I had learned about my grandparents, about their love for each other and for the people in their lives. I thought about the 50 years of wasted friendship between my grandfather and Robert, the years of anger and misunderstanding that had robbed them both of a meaningful connection. I also thought about my own life, about the person I had been before all this, and the person I was becoming. I had come to Robert's house thinking only of the inheritance, of the financial security that awaited me at the end of this strange ordeal. But somewhere along the way, I had found something much more valuable. One evening, as we were sitting in the garden watching the sunset, Robert turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "when Eleanor was sick, she made me promise something." "What was that?" I asked, curious about this new insight into my grandmother's wishes. "She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would look after your grandfather," Robert replied. "She said he would be lost without her, that he would need his best friend more than ever." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I tried to keep that promise, you know, even after he accused me of, well, you know what he accused me of. I still watched out for him, from a distance. I made sure his business competitors didn't take advantage of his grief. I kept an eye on his house when he traveled. I even sent anonymous donations to charities he supported.
I looked at Robert with new understanding. The feud between him and my grandfather had been complicated, colored by unspoken feelings and unfulfilled promises. Even in their estrangement, Robert had continued to care for his friend, honoring the promise he had made to my grandmother. "Why didn't you ever tell him?" I asked. Robert smiled sadly. "Pride, mostly. Your grandfather was proud, and I was hurt. We were like two children who had fallen out, each waiting for the other to apologize first, neither willing to be the one to break the silence." As summer progressed, Robert and I continued to explore the shared history of our families. We visited places that had been significant to my grandparents: the restaurant where they had their first date, the park where they had gotten engaged, the hospital where my mother was born. With each visit, with each story Robert shared, I felt myself growing closer to the grandparents I had lost, understanding them not just as family members, but as complex individuals who had loved deeply, made mistakes, and tried their best to navigate the complicated terrain of human relationships. One afternoon, as we were looking through old photo albums, I came across a picture that caught my attention. It showed my grandparents and Robert on what appeared to be a camping trip, all three of them laughing around a campfire. "Where was this taken?" I asked, pointing to the photograph. Robert smiled, his eyes bistant with memory. "That was at Echo Lake, our favorite camping spot. We went there every summer, the three of us. Eleanor loved the sound of the loons at night. Your grandfather loved fishing. I loved watching them both be so happy together." "Have you been back there since?" I asked. Robert shook his head. "Not after she died. It didn't feel right, going there without her." An idea began to form in my mind. What if we went? What if we took a trip to Echo Lake to honor their memory? Robert considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. "I think Eleanor would like that. And Henry too, wherever he is." The following weekend, we packed camping gear and made the 3-hour drive to Echo Lake. As we set up our tent and built a campfire, I could almost feel the presence of my grandparents, as if they were there with us, smiling at this reunion of sorts. That evening, as we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and watching the stars emerge, Robert shared stories about the camping trips he had taken with my grandparents. "Eleanor was terrible at cooking over a fire," he said with a laugh. "Everything was either burnt or raw, but she insisted on doing it herself, said it was part of the experience." "What about my grandfather?" I asked. "Was he any better?" "Henry was better at fishing than cooking," Robert said, a fond smile on his face. "He could catch a fish with a string and a bent paperclip, I swear. But he'd always get so involved in telling some elaborate story that he'd forget the fish was on the fire until it was a charcoal brick. We ate a lot of burnt fish on those trips, but we didn't care. We were happy." As he spoke, I looked at the flickering firelight dancing on his face, and I saw not the stern, guarded man I had first met, but a young man full of life and love, remembering the happiest times of his life. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. The trip to Echo Lake was the turning point for me. Seeing the place where my grandparents and Robert had been so happy, hearing the stories of their friendship, I understood the true legacy my grandfather had left me. It wasn't about the money. It was about the love, the friendship, the forgiveness that had defined their lives, even when they had struggled to live up to those ideals. When we returned from our trip, I felt a sense of peace and certainty that I had never experienced before. I knew what my choice was, and I knew that it was the right one. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrison's office and scheduled an appointment. Robert offered to come with me, but I told him this was something I needed to do on my own. As I sat in the same law firm's conference room where I had first learned about the strange condition in my grandfather's will, I felt a sense of closure, of coming full circle. "I've made my decision," I said to Mr. Harrison, my voice steady and clear. The lawyer looked at me over his glasses, his expression unreadable. "And what is your decision, Taylor?" "I choose friendship," I said. "I choose truth and reconciliation over financial gain. I choose to honor my grandmother's memory and my grandfather's true intentions, even if it means forfeiting the inheritance." Mr. Harrison smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "I knew you would, Taylor. Your grandfather was confident that you would.
He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. "He left this for me to give you if you made this choice." I took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a letter from my grandfather, along with a new set of documents. "My dear Taylor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have passed the final test. You have chosen the path of wisdom and compassion, and I could not be prouder of you. The inheritance is yours, as it always was. But more importantly, the legacy of love and forgiveness that your grandmother embodied is now yours to carry forward. The documents enclosed with this letter transfer the entire estate to you, as originally specified. In addition, they establish the Eleanor and Henry Foundation for Reconciliation, which will be funded with a portion of the estate and which you will oversee. This foundation will support organizations and individuals working to heal broken relationships, to promote forgiveness, and to bring people together across divides. You see, my dear granddaughter, the true wealth is not in the money, but in the love we share, the friendships we nurture, and the compassion we show to others. You have learned this lesson well, and in doing so, you have honored not only my memory, but also the memory of your grandmother, who was the true heart of our family. Live well, Taylor. Live with love, with courage, and with an open heart. That is the greatest inheritance of all. With all my love and pride, Henry." As I finished reading, tears of gratitude streamed down my face. My grandfather, in his own complicated, convoluted way, had given me the greatest gift of all. Not just financial security, but a deeper understanding of what truly matters in life. That evening, I shared the news with Robert. We sat in the garden, just as we had so many times before, but this time there was a new sense of peace and completion between us. "He really did it, didn't he?" Robert said, a smile playing on his lips. "He found a way to bring us back together, even after he was gone." "He did," I replied, smiling back at him, "and he left us with the responsibility to carry on his and my grandmother's legacy." As the sun set on the garden that had been the site of so many of our conversations, I felt a sense of hope and excitement for the future. The year that had begun as a strange condition in my grandfather's will had transformed into a journey of discovery, healing, and redemption. I had come to Robert's house seeking an inheritance, but I had found something much more valuable. I had found a friend, a connection to my family's past, and a deeper understanding of myself and the world around me. And as I looked towards the future, I knew that I was ready to embrace the legacy my grandfather had left me. Not just the money, but the responsibility to live a life of love, compassion, and forgiveness. The inheritance would provide me with financial security, yes, but the true wealth was in the lessons I had learned, the friendships I had formed, and the person I had become. And that was a legacy far more precious than any amount of money. As I finished reading, tears of gratitude streamed down my face. My grandfather, in his own complicated, convoluted way, had given me the greatest gift of all. Not just financial security, but a deeper understanding of what truly matters in life. That evening, I shared the news with Robert. We sat in the garden, just as we had so many times before, but this time there was a new sense of peace and completion between us. "He really did it, didn't he?" Robert said, a smile playing on his lips. "He found a way to bring us back together, even after he was gone." "He did," I replied, smiling back at him. "And he left us with the responsibility to carry on his and my grandmother's legacy." As the sun set on the garden that had been the site of so many of our conversations, I felt a sense of hope and excitement for the future. The year that had begun as a strange condition in my grandfather's will had transformed into a journey of discovery, healing, and redemption. I had come to Robert's house seeking an inheritance, but I had found something much more valuable. I had found a friend, a connection to my family's past, and a deeper understanding of myself and the world around me.
And as I looked towards the future, I knew that I was ready to embrace the legacy my grandfather had left me. Not just the money, but the responsibility to live a life of love, compassion, and forgiveness. The inheritance would provide me with financial security, yes, but the true wealth was in the lessons I had learned, the friendships I had formed, and the person I had become. And that was a legacy far more precious than any amount of money.